Welcome to another episode of Inflection. I am Brian Berletic. Joining me as always is Angelo Giuliano. Hello, Angelo. How are you?
Hi, Brian. Always great to be on your show.
Yes, great to have you here. And we really welcome your expertise. And I think this week we're going to need it. We're going to talk about the 2011 Arab Spring, the US engineered Arab Spring that happened in 2011, and how it has kind of continued to linger over the North Africa and Middle Eastern region, and how it is kind of morphing and spreading out over Asia. We're going to talk about that. And we've got two news items that we're going to talk about first that are semi-related, because it's kind of like this Asia Spring that's happening right now. It's all part of that. So we'll just get right into it. I'm going to be doing a video on this, and I'm going to show you the questions that I received in the email. I had someone from Malay Mail, it's a Malaysian newspaper, contact me, and they asked me these questions. And the nature of the questions are very loaded. They're very loaded questions. They obviously have an agenda. And it's one of those situations, Angela, I'm sure you've experienced this, and some of the expat vloggers in China have experienced this, where they get an email from the BBC, and it's so obvious that they already wrote their article, and they just want some quotes from you to twist out of context to kind of cement their narrative altogether. So that's what this was all about. And this person, I asked them, because I'm not going to answer their questions by email. I'm going to make a video answering them. Let's see, where is it? So he sent me this link. This is him right here, Zorairi. And he says that he is the East Asian representative of International Association of Religion Journalists. And I asked him directly, I said, are you funded by any of these foreign groups? And he says no, but he's the representative of this organization. So if you go to that organization, it's co-sponsored by the ICFJ. If you go to the ICFJ's website and you look down to who is supporting them, who's supporting them? Government agencies, USAID, and the US State Department. So I asked him again, and I'm still waiting for an answer. Why did you leave this out? You didn't know about this? Or you're not telling me? And the gist of his questions are really, why are you getting involved in Malaysia's politics? And I'm showing people that America is involved in Malaysia's politics. And he tried to spin it as if I'm some white privileged male sticking my nose in their business. But actually, I'm just pointing out that as an American, my tax dollars are going into interfering in Malaysia's internal political affairs. I have a right to speak up about it. And if they don't like it, they should stop taking the money. That's basically the sum of it. And why? Because they're having these protests in Malaysia. They are linked to the ones in Thailand, Myanmar, and they were linked to the protests in Hong Kong that have since died down. So that's that news. That's that part of it. So we're going to talk about the Asia Spring a little bit more later on. But this just kind of shows you how out of control it is. And how every single one of these people, they pretend like it's legitimate opposition. But if you just do a little digging, it's always connected to the U.S. government. Angela, don't you think that's a little, is that a coincidence?
You see, I think we get this quite often. And I think it's important for viewers to understand why we are doing what all those videos, trying to explain to people what is happening. They questioning us as being white. They call us privileged people that actually don't understand about what is happening on the ground and so on. And there's one thing which is important. I think there's only Malaysians that can really judge the situation in Malaysia. Our job is not to say who's right, who's wrong. It's just to expose foreign interference. And I think you've been in Asia for 20 years. I've been in China for 25 years. I think I have an opinion. And if they are criticizing China and it's not what China is, I have a legitimate answer to say, well, this is not the China you're picturing. I'm on the ground. I see, this is what I see. Then people that can make their own judgment. Now, just going back to what you said Asia Spring. Actually, I think that color revolution started actually, probably the first one started in Asia. Then you had the Arab Spring, and now it's kind of coming back to Asia. Because remember, the first revolution, 1988, Myanmar, and I think this was, they used to call it Burma. And then 1989 was a so-called color revolution. You had Voice of America, which was very present, and China was quite open in 1989. So there was meddling, massive meddling, and it's since 1989 that China learned, and it knew about this whole strategy, the playbook, the Green Shark playbook of color revolution, and since then it got really smart. And this is why you have a firewall in China, and they're being very careful about, foreign interference, because they've learned about what has been done in the Arab Spring, in Syria and so on, and they're way smarter. But it got, 1989 was a student protest, and just hijacked, like most of those revolutions. It might start like legitimate, but then it gets hijacked by foreign interference.
Absolutely. Actually, that is a really good point. I didn't even really think about that. I thought you were going to say in 2010 and 2009, we had some stuff going on here in Southeast Asia, and then the very next year was the Arab Spring. They're running all of this all the time, and then when they see a big opportunity, they go for it. And so in the Middle East, they had a big opportunity. Sometimes they try to coax things to create the opportunity. But you're right. I mean, we're probably going to do a whole episode just on the Tiananmen Square incident. That's because there's so much to it, and so many lies that have just been cemented into place because they've been repeated so often. But you're right about that. And again, when people say authoritarian, that they're ignoring the fact that these countries are under attack. They're under attack, and countries that do not take these steps are obliterated. We're going to talk about some of those countries, especially during the Arab Spring. Let's do one more news item, and we will get right into the Arab Spring. So let's go to Mother Jones. I never really read Mother Jones, and I've heard that some people said they used to be good, but they're not anymore, and they obviously are ridiculous now, because I saw this article. Myanmar opposition leader, we need more help from Biden to defeat the military junta. And this is Dr. Sasa. And who is he? His background. He went to England, and his patron was, I think it was Prince Charles. So his patron is the British royal family who had overseen the empire that had colonized his country. And now he's going to the UK, and now he's back to play a part in this client regime that the US and the UK are trying to set up. Now, I'm going to go down here to where, because it's a lot. Yeah, they even say Prince Charles here they even say it here in the article. And nobody seems to see if there's anything wrong with that. So he's saying, Sasa notes that the NUG, which is the National Unity Government, this is a fake parallel government that the ousted opposition set up, and that they want the US to recognize. So this is another scenario like in Venezuela, where the US recognized Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela, and he was like carrying his own podium around, his own fake presidential podium around Venezuela to give speeches. So this is another case where this is what they're trying to line up and get done. So he's saying okay, let's see. But he says Biden can go further to help beat back the coup. There's lots of more leverage that needs to be done to put more pressure on the military junta. And he said specific measures. And then he says recognizing the NUG as the sole legitimate government of Myanmar. Now, there's more to get into. But before we do that, this will create so many problems. I'm going to say one, and Angela, and you could think of some other problems this will create. The main problem I can think of is that ASEAN is going to be put on the spot then, because the US is going to recognize this government, and ASEAN is not into interfering in other countries in ASEAN's internal affairs. And so are they going to be pressured to recognize this fake parallel government? Angelo? What do you see coming out of this?
Well, they try to do the same as they did in South America. So you saw most of South American countries, which are leaning for the US, they took side for Juan Guaido. So they're trying to replicate this with ASEAN, but ASEAN it's much less political. The purpose of ASEAN is just economical. So I doubt that it will be successful. And I think most of the countries in Southeast Asia, they know what is happening, what is the reality in Myanmar. So I doubt this pressure will be successful. I think NUG, what they might do is they might block some funds, like the same as they did in Venezuela. Remember, Great Britain blocked $1 billion in gold. And actually, Juan Guaido at this moment can dispose of this gold. I mean, money. He's paying his bill, lawyers' bills with this gold. So what could happen is that you could imagine that the Western government just blocking some funds and giving it the disposition, giving to NUG. There's a possibility.
Actually, exactly. You mentioned that, and that's exactly what it says in the article. So Dr. Sasa, he's saying it would give them access to about $1 billion in Myanmar government funds frozen in the United States since the military took power. And then, it just goes on from there. And this is exactly, and the reason we're talking about this, and I mean, in February, when you and I were talking about this since February. It was very obvious what was going on. And a lot of people said, no, that's not true. Aung San Suu Kyi loves China. She was going to work with China. The US is behind Myanmar's military. You're totally wrong about this. And now we see the fake parallel government begging the US to recognize them. China doesn't recognize them and won't recognize them. One more part of this story. There was also this. So Wendy Sherman is the deputy U.S. Secretary of State. And she's saying, I spoke with Zin Mar Aung today to discuss efforts by the NUG and others to return Burma, they're still calling it Burma, to the path of democracy and to combat the pandemic. We salute the courage and conviction of the people of Burma as they seek to build an inclusive democratic future. So there's Zin Mar Aung, and there's the Deputy Secretary of State. And so what they're doing is they're pretending like, oh, we don't know if we're going to recognize the National Unity Government or not. We're not sure. We're on the fence about this. We're going to wait and see how it plays out. But let me tell you the background of Zin Mar Aung. Okay, let's see the first Exhibit A. She has her own web page on the National Endowment for Democracy's website. So she's a fellow. This is under fellows, home fellows, Miss Zin Mar Aung. Okay, so that's one. And then I think down here they talk about she has the Yangon School of Political Science. This is NED funded. It even says right here it's an NED funded institution. And if you go to their Facebook page, who's that? Angela, do you recognize that man sitting there?
I forgot his name, but he's what's his name?
Sean Turnell, the Australian economist.
He was the advisor. I mean, I don't know. It's just if the advisor, or what can you say? He was keeping Aung San Suu Kyi on the leash, right?
Yes, one of several.
And so Sean Turnell, just to give him to give the background, he used to work for to be a consultant for the U.S. State Department, for the George Soros Foundation, and for USAID. So he has a company right now in Myanmar called MDI, which is financed by USAID. But at the same time, he's working as a private consultant to Aung San Suu Kyi. And his main purpose is, how can I destroy Belt and Road Initiative project? That's his main purpose. That's all he does. That's all he does.
Yes. And he talks about how to get the IMF and World Bank in, and how to, how all the Chinese projects are ridiculous. Let's go back, because it gets worse. And I'm not even done. This is just her school we're talking about. NED funded school. She's an NED fellow. She's the minister of foreign affairs for the parallel government. This is them talking about the school's head. She's the founder. This is the head. And who's he meeting with? This is Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama. Let's see, where's his?
He's on the page of NED page. He's on
yes, right here. So he has his own page on the NED. So that's what that school was. They were just bringing in regime change specialists, meddlers, handlers. They were just bringing them all in. It was all part of building up the administrative network that empire in modern days uses to control a country. And so here is lectures in Yangon, Francis Fukuyama and Larry Diamond. And so they had event after event like this at her school. There's also this, Burma 2015, the make or break moment for democratization. And so she's in Washington, D.C. at an NED event. What else is Min Zar Aung? What else has she been involved in? She's getting the 2012 International Women of Courage Award from then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and then First Lady Michelle Obama. So, I mean, it's not even that they're backing her. She is a creation of U.S. foreign policy and meddling. That is who she is, and that's who the Deputy Secretary of State was talking to. And this is who they're pretending they're not sure whether or not they want to back her. They back the national unity government up one side and down the other. They're just not sure about whether they should do it openly or not, because they're worried the same thing might happen that happened with Juan Guaido. It'll just become a giant joke. And you alluded to that, actually, Angelo, about how ASEAN's probably not going to go for it. Or if they do it, it's going to take significant pressure from the US to get them to go along with that. You have anything else to add to this, Angelo? This is so ridiculous when you know who these people are.
Well, sometimes I just wonder, I mean, the aim, the purpose of those people that are willing to betray their own country. I mean, do they realize that their country is going to lose their sovereignty, to be completely raided by Western corporation? Because this is one of the purpose. It has nothing to do with freedom and democracy. It's about geopolitical and how to encircle China. You know, do they know that? I just wonder that. And ultimately, the purpose is how they can open the Myanmar to foreign Western big corporation. And this is what I call raping of a country. So, you know, I just don't understand those people willing to betray their own country. Do they have the knowledge of that? Do they know it? Do they do this knowingly? It's very strange.
Well, just to fill in a little bit more detail, you were talking about Sean Turnell as the economic handler. I don't think advisor is the right word. Handler for Aung San Suu Kyi. She had another British citizen advising her on legal matters to rewrite the whole constitution, and then another British citizen who was also working at the same time working at the UK Foreign Office. And I don't really know what he was doing because they're very secretive about that. But that was acknowledged. And so there's that. So it was basically the US and the UK running Myanmar's government with just these Myanmar faces as cover. It was functioning just like a British Empire administrative network. So there's that. And what are they thinking is a good question. I think there's different pathologies for different people. I think some of them are, in Thai we call lok soi, which means beautiful world. They have this overly idealistic vision of the world. They think the US is a force for good. They lie to themselves about the ugly things they see the US doing. They say, well, that's separate. That's not what they're doing here. What they did in Iraq is totally different than what they're doing here. And they lie to themselves. And why did they lie to themselves? Because they were approached by the US Embassy or someone who really impressed them and made them feel important. And they like that feeling of feeling important. They're otherwise small, irrelevant people. And then this is how they build up their self-esteem. It's just very sad. And this is what empire has always done all throughout history. They use insecure people to build their empire with. And so I don't know how many are actually willingly doing it and fully understand what they're doing and are going along with it, although there are some. But I think most of them really are just people are just so out of touch with reality, and they're lying to themselves above everything else, kind of like being part of a cult, I guess.
Yeah, I think you made a very good point. I think they play on the ego. Also, there's some. I mean, they're not very smart. I mean, you see, Joshua Wong. He's not very smart. I mean, they recruited him. He's very insecure. So overnight he becomes someone. He was nobody, becomes someone, and so yeah, it's very sad and very very unfortunate. But and also I think Hollywood makes also a big difference. The thing is that if you see from the Western media perspective, and you see it from Hollywood, the concept of freedom, human rights, and democracy coming from the West, it is very sexy. I mean, really, to be part of this project, it looks so nice, but actually this is just marketing. It's applying marketing to a product. What they did to a product, they did it for human rights, democracy, and open society. But it's not. It's a new style, rebranding of colonialism and imperialism. It's nothing else. Because the reality, it's like US-style democracy is not a democracy. I think we said it I said it before. I mean, China in many ways is way more democratic than in the US. It's just that people don't dig too much. People are led. Those people that are advocating for color revolution are led by emotions. And it looks cool. This is the generation doing selfie on Instagram. This is this generation, but it's not a generation that is actually going seeking facts. Not emotional. It's not about emotion. It's about facts. Being rational. If you have a rational mind, then we have aligned discussions. But you see, once you talk to those protesters, is it rational? Once you start, I was in Hong Kong, and I would ask those protesters a simple question. What did you lose since 1997 handover of Hong Kong to China? What did you lose in terms of freedom? And they panic because they don't have any rational answers. What they say is that, we lost freedom. Okay, can you tell me which freedom did you lose? Because it's not tangible. It's emotional. And this is how they mislead those kids, because they play on the emotional part of the brain, not the rational side. Because once you look at the rational side, you start learning about history. Because you need, if you want to understand present moment, you need to learn about history. And again, since the Second World War, the US has been a predator. It has been aggressive all around the world. There's no reason that it will not replicate the same thing in Southeast Asia.
Exactly. And I think this is the perfect springboard into the main topic about the Arab Spring, about how I believe a lot of people in positions of power here in Southeast Asia, not just prime ministers and presidents, but people in these governments, they're complacent because they don't think that it can happen to them. And I think we should explore what the situation was like in 2011 before the Arab Spring turned into a regional catastrophe. I just want
to ahead. Just one more thing. I mean, those color revolutions are sold differently. It depends on the country. But I analyzed the Ukraine Maidan revolution in 2014. Actually, what they were selling the kids in Ukraine was that Ukraine will be closer to the EU, and you will be able to work in the EU. What the kids were looking for was to leave Ukraine and to work in countries that are more well off than Ukraine. And it was not about contributing to Ukraine. It was, how can I leave my country? And I'm willing to betray my country in order to go to Europe and work in Europe. And then contribute to low labor cost. Because you are going to be a second-grade citizen in Europe, and you are going to put pressure on indigenous workers, because this is what open borders is about. It's not about you don't want immigration. It's about it's for the capitalist. It's how can I get cheap immigration and put pressure on local labor.
And that's a really good point. And that's not speculation on your part, Angela. That is just look at the EU already as it exists and the disparity between certain member states and how labor works, how the economy works, how debt is passed around and maintained and unresolved. And that's exactly what Ukraine would have ended up. It would have ended up on the lower end. It would have ended up exploited and kicked around. And actually, that's what's happening to it anyway. It's not even part of the EU or NATO. So they got the worst of every possible scenario. And that really is just yet another example of US-backed interference. It never turns out well. When it is successful, that country has no future. Again and again and again and again. So let's take a look. I wrote this article. This was all the way back in 2011. I wrote this in 2011, and it was kind of a summary of the Arab Spring. And I remember back then people were all arguing with me. No, it's they're legitimate protests. The U.S. had nothing to do with it. The protests are anti-U.S. and anti-Israel. It could not be further from the truth. They played people like a fiddle, especially with the issue of Israel. Because so many people hate Israel so much that it blinds their ability to reason and look at the situation. So what I did was, in this article, I did a timeline, not of the 2011 events, but of what led up to it. So it goes all the way back to 2008. 2008 is when the US State Department and social media giants in the United States were organizing events to train, equip, and then send back all of these groups to their country to overthrow them. And as a matter of fact, there is this WikiLeaks cable that was released, and this forced the New York Times to admit to all of this. And we'll get to that article in a minute. But this is about one of the Egyptian opposition leaders traveling to the US and going to what they called the Alliance of Youth Movements Summit. This is kind of like the proto-Oslo Freedom Forum. This is kind of like where it all got started. And he talks about how he was there, how they helped keep his identity secret, because they didn't want this getting out. The only reason it got out is because of WikiLeaks. People need to remember that. And this was the April 6th movement. And this is actually how I cracked the first clue of the Arab Spring being US-backed. I kept noticing April 6th, so I did some digging, and that's how I found out about this. And they talk about all of this. Is there anything in this cable, Angelo, that you want to kind of point out? I think there's one thing. I'll let you.
Going back to Egypt is being stopped by the local authorities. It's just being surprised. I mean, why would you be surprised to be stopped by local authorities? You are openly betraying your country, But when you're attending those forums, the purpose of those forums is how can you steer up chaos and a color revolution. That's the purpose, nothing else.
And in this cable, they admit that his goal and the goal of many of the groups was to overthrow their respective governments in 2011. So this was 2008, and the goal was to get all of this done in 2011. And you're right, the Egyptian authorities stopped him. If the Egyptian authorities knew then what they know now, they probably would have just kept this guy in jail. And this is one of the problems every country faces, this balancing act between not provoking too big of a standoff with the US by rounding up their agents, but keeping them under control. And then there's this fine line between you keep letting them out and they keep doing it, and you keep arresting them and letting them out, trying to be lenient, trying not to look like a dictator. But the West is going to call you a dictator no matter what you do. So if they just put these people away for good, for treason, because that's what they were engaged in, it might have turned out differently. It might have still had a problem, but it might not have been as big of a problem. There were a lot of deaths, and people forget about Egypt. There was a lot of violence and death in Egypt. It was overshadowed by the war in Libya and then the war in Syria and Yemen. But there were also a lot of deaths in Egypt. There was the Muslim Brotherhood involved. This is like the political arm of Al-Qaeda, basically. And people are always saying that, oh, they're anti-Israel, they're anti-US. No, they're just like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They are a proxy that is used in the region, and they dupe people into joining by making people think that they're anti-Israel and anti-US. Angelo, do you have anything else about this part, the lead up in Egypt and this opposition group?
Yeah, you mentioned balancing. You need to balance. Somehow you cannot have too tough, too strong national security laws. And I have an example like Rabia Kadir. She was this billionaire corrupted Uyghur in China, and she was arrested because she was planning some terrorist actions. I mean, related to Xinjiang independence, and she was sending lots of money abroad for this purpose. So the Chinese government stopped her, but after some pressure, a lot of pressure from the US, she was released. The first thing she did was to leave the China for the US, and now she's working actively for the World Uyghur Congress. I mean, she's the unofficial head of the World Uyghur Congress. So you see, the thing is that it's always about fine line. I need to protect my national security law, but I need to once you are too tough, you get so much pressure, from those NGOs. So it's a fine line. It's a fine line between national security law and being somehow an open society.
Yes, and so we're probably going to have to talk about that some more here in a minute. But I just wanted to point out this 2011 New York Times article: U.S. groups helped nurture Arab uprisings. Now, people familiar with my work, I've probably quoted this a million times, but it's so important because it says right here, says everything right here. A number of the groups and individuals directly involved in the revolts and reforms sweeping the region, and they include April 6th youth movement in Egypt, received training and financing from groups like the International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House, and they're based in Washington, and they cite the WikiLeaks document here. And all of these are subsidiaries of the National Endowment for Democracy, which they admit down here, the National Endowment for Democracy. And then they talk about some Egyptian youth leaders attended a 2008 technology meeting in New York, where they were taught to use special networking and mobile technologies to promote democracy. Among those sponsoring the meeting were Facebook, Google, MTV, Columbia Law School, and the US State Department. And I actually have here is the 2008 attendee biographies. And if you just type in Facebook, it comes up 46 times. Like US social media companies are working with the US State Department. So if you US State Department, if you look that up, look at all these people from the US State Department in the meeting. So I mean, this is what they were doing as early as 2008. Now, keep that date in mind, because let's take a look at these stories. And I remember this, and Angelo, I think you remember this too. This is from 2009. Kerry meets Assad, hails important moment of change. And this was the US kind of obviously pretending, now in hindsight, obviously pretending to repair their relationship with Syria. And do people remember this? This was in 2009 also. So Obama shaking hands with Gaddafi. I think this was like the first US president that he actually met, because Libya and the US had very bad relations. And the US was doing this on purpose. They were making it look like they were turning over a new page with these countries. They were luring them into a false sense of security. And all while they were doing this, they were plotting to overthrow their governments. For Gaddafi, his whole family was exterminated. His grandkids were bombed by NATO, and he was killed.
He was raped. He was raped,
basically slaughtered like an animal in the streets by these terrorists, who have ever since then just run the country right into the ground. It doesn't even exist as a functioning nation state right now. So those were the fruits of the so-called Arab Spring, which again, we're going to get into the Asia Spring. But when you hear people say Asia Spring, don't they realize what they're saying? The entire, from North Africa to Central Asia and everywhere in between was burned to the ground by the Arab Spring. And now they're calling for Asia Spring. Do they realize the implications of what they're calling for and what they're involved in? But Angelo, go ahead. Like this lead up to the Arab Spring, this fake, I know you were telling me about Libya and France played a very, very active role in the overthrow of the Libyan government and the destruction of the Libyan state.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You saw, like just before attacking Syria and Libya, the West was getting very close to its enemies. So it comforts the saying of keep your friends close and keep your enemies even closer. And this was the strategy, just to give a false sense of security. I lost my train. Just
you were telling me about Gaddafi and actually going to France.
So Gaddafi was received like a king. Like there was never in French history that a foreign president would go to France and be received like Gaddafi was received. But there's a big story behind this. Gaddafi actually financed Sarkozy government by his election. He paid 50 million euro. And there's an agency, the equivalent of a gray zone for France is called Mediapart, and they've done investigation. But the only problem is that Sarkozy, even right now, he has a penalty of 2 years in jail, but he's being in his house, a huge house in the center of Paris. He has a garden, and it's as if he's free. It's the same as when Epstein was jailed, the first time. And actually would spend just 8 hours a night, and in the prison, and would go out, and and he had lots of permissions. I mean, basically, it's not jail, because white collars and politicians in France don't go to jail. But this is one thing which is really important. Gaddafi became an enemy, became a liability for Sarkozy, and this is why Sarkozy and Bernard-Henri Lévy, this guy always with the white shirt, who was actually very active in the Maidan Revolution, if you remember. So Sarkozy did everything he could because he knew that Gaddafi was a liability. Gaddafi had registered, had videos of encounters between Sarkozy and himself. And this became a liability. So the first thing when they overthrew Gaddafi, the first thing that the French did was to go into his palace and to destroy all the evidence, all the tapes.
Yeah, and you have to wonder. On one hand, the West was probably encouraging Gaddafi to get involved in all of this, and then on the other hand, they needed leverage over France to get them. A lot of countries in Europe are. Actually, to be honest, France seems very eager to get involved everywhere in Africa. Honestly, I don't think it takes much convincing, but to have this relationship between Sarkozy and Gaddafi, one way or the other, it was being used to lure Libya into a false sense of security. I don't think that he thought that they were serious about going through with the whole thing. I think Gaddafi thought he was indispensable because, like he said before they killed him, and then what exactly happened was Libya was where all the people in Africa would go to find jobs and a safe place to live. It was a very well-developed country relative to everything else on the continent, and they would go there to find a new life. And he said, if you destroy Libya, all these people are just going to go past Libya right into Europe, and that's exactly what happened right after they destroyed Libya. And the same thing happened to Hosni Mubarak. I'm pretty sure he thought that they wouldn't do anything to him. He saw himself as, playing a balancing act, but everyone's kind of agreed that, oh yeah, Egypt is an ally of the US. They would never overthrow Hosni Mubarak, which is why a lot of people were tricked in the beginning. And then because of these overtures the West was making to Gaddafi and Assad and the relationship they had with Hosni Mubarak, this is what fooled so many people in the beginning. This is why they didn't understand that it was a US engineered region-wide regime change operation. And then, like I said, then the New York Times admits it. all right here. Now, what we saw in that WikiLeaks document, and then what we see in this really old article from New York Times, I'm not even sure what year this is from, but this is about Serbia. I think like in the when was this? The 1990s. Yeah, right at the end there, when they threw out Slobodan Milosevic. This opposition movement was created and funded by the U.S. They would not have succeeded without that U.S. backing. And they go through how the U.S. clandestinely built up this opposition movement. If you read that WikiLeaks document through, you will notice how they were having secret meetings with this Egyptian opposition leader and everyone in Washington. So they go to these events, but then they have these side meetings and appointments that they don't tell anybody about, that they only talk about in diplomatic cables they thought no one would ever read. And so this is what was going on right before the Arab Spring, and then it happened, and all these leaders were caught off guard. Analysts, people that usually get geopolitics right, were caught off guard and were confused. And as we always say here, just follow the money. So find the name of these opposition groups and figure out who's funding them, and then you can figure out who's behind it. And if you did that, you would have known from the very beginning that it was U.S. engineered. So, Angelo, anything else about the Arab Spring? Because I think I want to try to connect it to the...
Just one note to Gaddafi. I mean, it's important to note what Gaddafi did for Africa. I mean, Gaddafi, he was the head of the African Union, so he was elected and he was praised by African countries because he was the one actually that financed the first African satellite to be sent. And also important, I think why France was targeting Gaddafi was because France is actually issuing currency, which is a CFA franc, to 14 countries in Africa. So, they don't necessarily have a presence, local presence in those countries as an imperial power, but they're imposing a currency which is issued by France. So once you're controlling the money, you have the ultimate control of a country. What Gaddafi wanted to do was to create an African currency which would be backed by gold. And that would become a huge problem for both the US and France, because it would undermine the hegemony of France and the US in Africa. Because again, physically Africa might not be colonized, but it's colonized in other ways. Through the IMF, the World Bank, through cooperation, through, and constantly you see, government are overthrown all the time, and there's a huge program of National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, they're all present in Africa, and they don't want Africa to develop. Thanks to China, now there's a Belt and Road Initiative. They are going to build the foundation for growth and prosperity for Africa, because prosperity starts from building roads. Chinese, they say, if you want to become rich, start building a road. If in Africa, remember, there's lots of parts in Africa don't even have electricity. So Libya was a model for Africa, and it wanted to replicate this for the rest of Africa. The same as China is a model for Asia, and it wants actually to expand this model of prosperity into the rest of Asia, because it's going to be win-win. If your neighbors are prosper, you are going to prosper yourself too. It's as simple as that.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because actually I think we forgot to mention why the US was doing this in the first place. Like, why are they destroying North Africa and the Middle East? What was the whole purpose of this? And I want to remind people of this article. This is from The Atlantic. This is also from 2011. And this is US Senator John McCain, who used to, he's dead now, but before he used to go to Libya and Syria and hang out with the terrorists that the US was arming and backing. And let's go down here. This is what he said. This was 2011. A year ago, Ben Ali and Gaddafi were not in power. Assad won't be in power this time next year. The Arab Spring is a virus that will attack Moscow and Beijing. And that was the whole point of the Arab Spring. The US engineered Arab Spring was to collapse all of these governments. And just like you said, Libya especially. Imagine if Libya was still run by Gaddafi and his political circle and the Belt and Road Initiative came along, how quickly things would have moved. And look at the mess that any country that wants to start developing Libya, look at the mess they're going to have to undo. It is a huge setback, years and years of a setback. And that was what it was all about. That it was supposed to encircle and contain Iran and eventually overthrow Iran. And then it was supposed to take these militants that the US was building up to conquer the region and put them on Russia's southern border near the Caucasus region, Chechnya, and then into Western China, Xinjiang, where they were already stirring up violent separatism. And so it's all connected. All of this is connected. And the Arab Spring was always meant to continue spreading through Eastern Europe and Southern Russia and across Central Asia into Western China, and then light Southeast Asia on fire. And they're still doing that. It's just slow motion because people are waking up to it and pushing back. And you remember General Wesley Clark, 7 nations in like however many years. They had to knock these governments out before China rose or before Russia reemerged. That was what they were racing against time to accomplish. And it looks like they ran out of time. And now here we are. And now we go to the Asia Spring. And I'm just going to introduce this, and then I want to hear your take, Angelo. So this was fairly 2020, October 2020, from Financial Times. Thai protests inspire Lao criticism, and what they're trying to, and John Reed is like a very biased, fake journalist who's practically promoting the protests here in Thailand. And they're saying this is about the Milk Tea Alliance. And it's an informal online grouping of pro-democracy activists in Thailand, India, Taiwan, and Hong Kong who have expressed solidarity and criticism of China's government in the run-up to the Thai protests. And then they mention Netue, who he's pro-democracy, but he has just this weird obsession with hating China. But that's what this is all about. This is the U.S. being unable to convince governments in Southeast Asia to cut their ties with China, because China is their largest trade partner, investor, source of tourism. They're a partner in military matters and infrastructure projects. They will never cut ties with China because it makes no sense for them to. So they want to replace these governments with regimes that are hostile to China. And failing that, they want to destabilize and burn the region down to deny China a prosperous region to partner with and rise up with. Angelo?
Well, it's very often like this. It's either we install a US puppet, and if it doesn't work, well, we create a failed state. Look at Libya. I mean, it was impossible to install a US puppet, then we create a failed state. Myanmar is the same. It didn't work with Aung San Suu Kyi, so we are going to create a civil war in Burma. You see, when it comes to Laos is probably 30% of its trade is with China. So it has a destiny. It has a past which is linked with China. It has a destiny which is linked to China. And this is something that you cannot change. Trades, money, talk. Moreover, a country like Laos, it's a landlocked country. It doesn't have access to the sea. So it's even poor. It's one of the poorest countries in Southeast Asia. It can only prosper through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's going to connect with, there's a fast train between Kunming and Thailand, and it's going through Laos. And this is going to be a huge opportunity for Laos. So again, Belt and Road Initiative is going to bring prosperity, and China is winning there, and now you see this Build Better World, or what is it, like this new initiative?
B3W.
They're trying to replicate the Belt and Road Initiative, but in reality, if you look into the bill, actually only very little is allocated into infrastructure. But you see, it's painful that organization like IMF, World Bank, initially was supposed to do that, and China is doing this, but 10 times bigger. But it's very important. There is no precondition to that. It's usually institution like IMF. They say, we are going to invest that much into your country, but you need to open up your capital, to your industries, And basically how we can rape you at the same time. Plus the conditions of the loans are those are shark loans. I mean, you put like into difficulty, and this is, they're actually applying what they accuse China of. They accuse China
Yes.
of debt trap, but the World Bank
Yes.
and IMF, this is what they do.
They did it, and they did it in Southeast Asia. People forget there was, at the end of the 90s, there was this huge economic crash because of the IMF and World Bank. And then they had the audacity to turn around and accuse China of debt trap diplomacy when they're building physical projects. They're not just handing out loans. But go ahead, Angelo. Continue.
You remember there's an interview of this Greek economist Varoufakis, and someone is asking him, oh, China is coming and is building roads, is building ports and so on, and he's like, what is wrong with building ports and roads? Countries need ports and roads. But they're doing imperialism. Oh no, China is far more humanistic. They're not coming with weapons. They're not gonna, they don't want to change the political system and so on. And actually, I think it's very smart. I think, in the West, we tend to say, oh, first have democracy and, Western style. They want Western style democracy and pro-US, pro-Western. And then we are going to do reforms in terms of economy. Well, the Belt and Road Initiative is a different approach. It says, well, we are going to take care of people first. Bring prosperity, basic human rights, which is linked to food, education, health. Those are basic human rights. If you tell an African, I'm going to give you freedom and human rights, but you don't have anything to eat. I mean, what's the point? I mean, it's like it doesn't make any sense. So you should actually watch this video. Varoufakis, he was a finance minister in Greece. And he's actually saying, well, China is far more humanistic, and build, roads and infrastructure, and you will solve so many problems. But again, the West doesn't want the global South to prosper. It doesn't want, because the global South, there's a much higher population. And in terms of GDP, it's going to be a problem. So you see China becoming the largest economy, it's only normal. Because it has a bigger population, and the global South has a much bigger population than the Europe and the US, and that's a danger. So basically, they want to contain those countries, but how can you contain normal path of prosperity? And it's not ideologic, because they don't care. It's not about the USSR. Used to be a bit about exporting communists. It's not about this. China is focusing on its people. It doesn't care. It's self-centered. If you learn about Chinese history, it was always self-centered, and China is a problem of its own. It's maintain a cohesion. Of the country. By itself, China. It's more than a country. It's a civilization state. It's a continent. So it has its own problems. So it doesn't, if it was to be imperialistic, if you don't solve your problem at home, how can you expand? I mean, and China doesn't have that. If you learn about Chinese history, it doesn't have this history. So when you look at the US, USA has its own problems, and it wants to export its system that is not working.
Yes, exactly.
So is why I think China is just waiting, and Russia is just waiting because some Western models might implode by itself, and then this is why I see time in favor of a multipolar world. As long as we don't have any war, you will have the global South, Russia and China, which will keep on prospering, working together, win-win. And then somehow, they hope that, either there are reforms and maybe the Western powers will rethink their approach, or they will implode by themselves.
Yes. So it's a really good point, and it's something that people don't think about. But the U.S. makes no secret that they seek primacy. They say in their policy papers and in speeches by presidents and comments made by senators, they want primacy over the Indo-Pacific region. And how can you do that if you have a smaller population, a smaller economy? How can you do that besides artificially arresting development in the Indo-Pacific region, to keep them down so that you can stay above them. And this makes absolutely no sense. They keep talking about a U.S.-led international order. Why is it U.S.-led? They don't have the biggest country, not in terms of size, not in terms of population, and soon not in terms of military or economic power. So why would they continue leading some international order that they claim exists, and these rules that they claim they uphold? Why that makes no sense when you really think about it. I just want to show people. I think I might have missed saying it, but they actually use the word Asian or ASEAN Spring in these articles. The opposition says this. So this is what we're seeing. We're seeing the U.S. trying to burn the region down to do exactly what you said, Angelo. They want to continue running everything, but they don't have the means to do it because they represent a fraction of the world's population. They're being surpassed by Asia, and the only way they can maintain primacy over a region that is rising is to keep it from rising, to keep it one notch below the U.S. And the way they're doing that is through political destabilization, exactly like what they did during the Arab Spring. And they destroyed those countries. And people talk about China investing in places like Syria if and when the war ends, and then they still have this huge mess that they have to onsort. And this has bought the U.S. years and years, at least in the Middle East. Imagine if none of that happened and China's Belt and Road Initiative reached the Middle East, how easy it would have been to implement it. But now they have to undo this huge mess. They have to undo this thing this project that the U.S. is working on with the Kurds to kind of give them this de facto state spanning, Turkish, Syrian, Iraqi, Iranian territory. They've just created a huge mess, and that's the real answer to the BRI, is lighting fires everywhere. The Build Back Better world was a smokescreen that they're doing this all behind. I want to, okay. And again, I'm just going to keep reiterating that US-based social media, we saw them do it during the Arab Spring, and they're doing it again. And it wasn't just an emoji. The emoji represents Twitter as a US-based social media platform that dominates the information space in Southeast Asia, officially getting behind this regional opposition movement. Twitter has done other things. They have deleted hundreds, if not thousands, of accounts in each one of these countries when they start speaking up about the US-backed opposition. They'll just purge them off their platform, and then only one side of the narrative remains. Angelo, there's some other link here that I got to try to find.
Yes.
Wait, hold on. The Oslo Freedom Forum.
So we saw Jack Dorsey.
Yes. Yeah, there he is, the CEO of Twitter. There he is, right in the middle. To the left is the sock puppet of choice for Belarus. The U.S. wants to install into power. Here is
just one thing. Fukuyama named her the president, right, of Belarus.
Oh yes, right here. Very pleased to meet President.
How can you say that? How can you say that? I mean, she doesn't represent the people of Belarus. I mean, she never won elections. I mean, she's just another puppet.
Isn't it interesting how not just the same fingerprints in terms of institutions and organizations in the U.S. are all over all of these political crises, but literally the exact same fingerprints of people like Francis Fukuyama are on all of these, in Myanmar, in Belarus, in the Middle East. It's always the same people that keep turning up. And so the other, okay, well, first of all, there's Thanathon Juangrung Ruangkit. He's the billionaire socket puppet of choice the U.S. wants in power in Thailand. Here's a Uyghur journalist. She works for Radio Free Asia. This is U.S. State Department media. She worked there for 20 years. And so you can see and there's Nathan Law, who was literally in Washington, D.C. after denying that the U.S. was behind the protests. Him and Joshua Wong and the whole gang were in Washington, D.C., begging openly for more U.S. aid after they denied having anything to do with the U.S. government. So we can see how the Oslo Freedom Forum is playing the same role as this alliance of youth movements. They're playing the same role. And there's a BBC clip where the BBC themselves admit what the Oslo Freedom Forum is. It's where the West trains agitators to go back to their country and try to overthrow the government. And they mentioned the Hong Kong mobs by name.
This may not evoke the spirit of the barricades, but the teaching here is to be successful, to topple a government for good, you have to be organized and to plan meticulously. And activists here have been involved in helping to organize the current protests in Hong Kong. Their plan to put thousands of people on the streets of the territory was in fact hatched nearly 2 years ago.
And dialogue is still the only hope that we have.
Jan Yilang protested in Tiananmen Square.
I'm Joshua Wong, the convener of Scholars.
He's talking to the Hong Kong students now on a daily, almost hourly basis.
Okay, Angelo, looks like we're at the 1 hour mark. Do you have any other thoughts about this? I think the one point that I want to make, and that people listening, especially if they're involved in any sort of decision making at all in ASEAN, one thing I would want them to hear and understand about this story about Arab Spring to Asia Spring is that the Arab Spring was so disastrous because almost every government in the region underestimated the threat of US subversion in their country. They just didn't think anything about it. They thought they may be aware of it, but they didn't think it was that big of a threat. And then in just a year, some countries just disappeared. Other countries were plunged into war that continues to this day. I would say Egypt is not really out of it yet. I mean, they have had so many problems since 2011, and I don't think that they're where they want to be yet. I think they've been set back quite a bit now. And so what I would want to say to people in ASEAN is don't be complacent. Don't underestimate this threat. Countries like China have that firewall. Countries like China and Russia restrict or have replaced platforms like Facebook and Twitter because they are literally being weaponized by the US government to destabilize and destroy countries. They have already done it, and they're obviously doing it again in Southeast Asia right now. So, Angelo, what would you want people in ASEAN, especially policymakers, what would you hope that they would take away from what happened in the Arab Spring and what we saw happen in Hong Kong?
Well, I think it's important to understand that the US doesn't really have allies. It has hostages. Well, you can take one country at a time. You just look at Japan. There's 50,000 US Army personnel in Japan. I mean, Japan is still being colonized. So it's not an ally. It's just a hostage. Look at India. If India is not following the US, you could imagine a color revolution in India. It would be extremely easy. Look at Germany. Germany is still occupied after the World War II, and it's being hostage. You know, when you tape, you're tapping the telephone of Merkel. You know, is that your ally? You don't do that to allies. So it's important to see that there are only a few allies that the US has. Maybe Canada, Australia, blindly follow the US, but the US is 4% of the world population. It's not sustainable to have 4% of the world population, which is ruling of the rest of the 100%. We are running towards a multipolar world, and that's the reality. And I really believe that Asian countries, they know that. It's just about how, the priorities is, it's not about, there's no friendship, there's national interest, and they need to look at national interest. US is declining, China is raising. It's a reality. China is your neighbor, US is a distant friend, which doesn't much care about Asian. I mean, look, and it's not that relevant for the US. I mean, look at the trade between the US and Asian. It's not big. It's not that important. But Asian depends much more. 30% of the trade of Asian is with China. So the future of Asian is with China. It's how they can balance this transition between China and the US. And the problem they have is that the US. There's this motto, they like to say you are either with us or you are against us. It doesn't work especially with Asian. Asian is Confucius, history and culture. It's about, there's no black and white. There's no black and white. It's not friend or enemy. It's much more balanced. While Western culture is more about, and probably there's a background which is related to the Bible. You are my friend or you are my enemy.
Absolute.
It's binary, and the world is not like this. We need a multipolar world where everybody has a say, and China is the future, because with China we will have a democracy at the global level, at the UN, and not the hegemony. I mean, look at what is happening at the UN. When you have only US and Israel that are supporting the sanctions against Cuba. I mean, is this democracy? It's not democracy. That's hegemony. That's bullying. That's inhumane. So maybe there's a better future with the peaceful emergence of China. There's some hope there.
And I've heard people here in the region say, it's inevitable that there's going to be this clash between the U.S. and China. And I don't think that it's inevitable. I mean, obviously there's going to be tension and conflict, but there need not be a outright clash, just like between the US and the Soviet Union. These were two nations that were creating deterrence. They were creating deterrence to prevent a major clash. And the same thing can happen with this US-China standoff, and especially the nations in Southeast Asia. There are measures that they can take to avoid becoming collateral damage. And some people say maybe we'll become collateral damage. People in the government here in Southeast Asia say this. And all I can say is it's already happening. You see the protests in the street. They're backed by the US. They have the same objective as the Arab Spring. We saw how that went. There are things you can do to cut these opportunities for the US off and leave the US only the option of constructive engagement. And that would benefit not just Southeast Asia, that would benefit most Americans. Most Americans are not behind this interventionism. And if they are, it's not genuine. It wasn't a decision they arrived at on their own, it was through propaganda. And so what can Asian countries do right now to kind of remove this option off the table from the US, this meddling? They can uproot these social media companies that are obviously tools of political interference and replace them with local social media alternatives. They can develop their English language news, just like CGTN in China or RT in Russia. They could do that, and then they could get their side of the story out. They could add balance to the narrative rather than just sitting there like a punching bag in their own country and have Western journalists just direct the entire narrative. There's BBC in Thai language in Thailand. So this is British state media telling Thai people in the Thai language what's going on in Thailand. Does that make any sense at all to you? At all? No. And yet this is allowed to happen. So these sort of things need to be solved. If you could get these mechanisms of influence under control, or at least balanced, you take that option off the table. And the only thing left for the US is to engage constructively, which honestly they need as much as Southeast Asia needs. Any last thoughts, Angelo?
No, I agree with you. Just additional to that, stronger national security laws. National security laws are essential just to protect national sovereignty. Again, I repeat, we said it many times, but you cannot have democracy if you don't have sovereignty. It's
absolutely.
So when you are meddling to a country, you're actually undermining the country's democracy, because it's about self-determination first. This is above everything. So we are not judging a country if it's left or right. We think the same. You and I, we think that sovereignty it's the number one priority for a country, and self-determination. People need to decide for their own fate. How an American politician should decide for my fate in Thailand or China? It doesn't make any sense. Only a Chinese or Thai is objective about his own, what he needs and what he wants. It's not Western. there's not a universal truth in the West. The West doesn't have the universal answer to what people need. You know, people need to decide for their own destiny.
Absolutely. Democracy is a process of self-determination. So if all of the decisions are being made in Washington, then it is not actually democracy. And I hear a lot of the protesters in Thailand, in Myanmar, and Malaysia talking about the Hong Kong model. If the Hong Kong model is what these US-backed protesters are using, I suggest that the nations of the region take a look at least certain aspects of the Beijing model that got the Hong Kong protests under control and restored peace and order to that territory, got people's lives back to normal, and gave people peace of mind knowing that this is not going to happen again in the future, because this always lingers here in Thailand. It always lingers when the protests are finally over. It always lingers in the back of their mind. When is it going to happen again? It's going to happen again when? That's because they have no national security law like in Hong Kong. So I think that is a good place to end the discussion. Thank you, as always, Angelo, for your expertise. I greatly appreciate it, and you taking the time to join us every week. It's really great.
Thank you.
To everybody out there who watches and likes and subscribes and shares, thank you so much. We could not do this without everybody's support. Check the video description for all of the links that we talked about during this discussion. They're going to be in the video description below. And there's also going to be information if you want to follow Angelo on social media, or find me on Patreon, because I'm not allowed on social media. I got kicked off. And until next week, bye for now.